When farmer James Bennett moved his family to eastern Orange County in 1846, he had no idea that it would earn him a place in history. Bennett was a yeoman farmer who lived with his family in a modest homestead adjacent to the road between Hillsborough and Durham's station. Year after year, James and wife Nancy eked out a living with their children, Eliza, Alfonso, and Lorenzo. The Bennett's lives were relatively untroubled until news of war reached them in April 1861. One by one, the Southern states left the Union to form and fight for their new country, the Confederate States of America. Lorenzo was the first to answer the Confederacy's call, enlisting in May 1862. Eliza's husband, Robert Duke, left a year later, and finally, the last son on the farm, Alfonso, in 1863. The Bennetts could not know that when these men left for war, they would never see them again. All were casualties in a drama that would play out the final scenes in the Bennett house. The road to Bennett Place began in May 1864 when Northern Major General William T. Sherman launched his campaign into the Southern heartland. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, with his Army of Tennessee, was determined to stop him. The two generals had fought against each other in the first major battle of the war, Bull Run, or Manassas as it was called by the victorious Confederates. But the tide of war had shifted in the subsequent years, and now Sherman had a chance to deliver a death blow to the Confederacy by marching south from Chattanooga toward Atlanta. Johnston desperately tried to block the advancing Yankees, but his efforts failed, and the Union Army moved into the city and one step closer to winning the war. Sherman now designed a plan that was considered risky by some, foolhardy by others, but was in fact brilliant. The Union general intended to invade the heart of the South and bring the war to its people. He wanted to destroy supplies useful to Confederate armies and cripple the South's ability and will to wage war. Sherman believed that if he made war cruel enough, the civilian population would cry for peace. The Union commander cut off his supply lines and marched his men out of Atlanta and arrived at Savannah a month later after what some Union soldiers likened to a Sunday jaunt. The ease of the campaign convinced Sherman to take the war to the Carolinas with the ultimate goal of linking up with General Ulysses S. Grant's army in Virginia. Moving north, Union soldiers brought destruction to South Carolina, especially to the capital of Columbia. Terrified refugees fled the city with all the possessions they could carry. Retreating Confederates destroyed everything that might be useful to the advancing enemy, and the Federals completed the destruction, leaving the capital a scorched ruin. General-in-Chief of the Confederate armies, Robert E. Lee, recalled Joseph Johnston from retirement to defend the South once again. Johnston was saddled with the daunting task of assembling available Southern soldiers and making them into a force that could defeat Sherman. The Confederates delayed a portion of Sherman's army by firing on them near the small North Carolina community of Averysboro on March 16, 1865. With the columns of the Union armies separated, Johnston set a trap near the village of Bentonville. On March 19th, he hurled his force at Sherman's surprised men. After 3 days of fierce fighting and over 4,000 casualties, Johnston realized his opportunity to destroy the invading army was lost, and his army retreated westward. Sherman moved to Goldsboro, where he received reinforcements from the coast, increasing his army to 100,000 men. General Sherman was summoned to Virginia, where he met with Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and others to discuss how to end the war. Lincoln expressed his desire to befriend the South and bring peace with fair terms. Sherman shared his commander's desire, but knew he had to first catch and then defeat Johnston's army. From Goldsboro, the reinforced Federal Army pursued Johnston and his men, capturing the state's capital on April 13th. As they marched, Sherman and his men were overjoyed to learn the news of Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Sherman was further surprised to receive a dispatch from Johnston requesting a truce in order for civil authorities to negotiate a surrender. The relieved Sherman agreed to meet Johnston the next day at a point somewhere between their two armies. On April 17th, as Sherman was leaving Raleigh for his meeting with Johnston, a telegram arrived from Union authorities in Washington. The general waited for the message to be decoded, then he read the disturbing news. He immediately concealed the dispatch, swore the telegraph operator to secrecy, and journeyed by train to Durham station. From there, Sherman and his escort continued on horseback toward Johnston, who was riding toward them from Hillsborough. Around noon, the two generals met for the first time. Sherman immediately recognized Johnston, rode up beside him, and shook his hand. He asked if Johnston knew of a place where they could confer in private. Johnston suggested using a small farmhouse he had just passed, the farm of James and Nancy Bennett. The Bennetts were startled by the sight of the two men, but agreed to allow the generals use of their home for a meeting. The Bennetts walked across the yard crowded with Confederate and Federal soldiers to their log kitchen, where they anxiously awaited the outcome. Though enemies for the past 4 years, Sherman and Johnston had arrived at the Bennett farmhouse with the same desire: peace. Once alone, Sherman presented Johnston with a secret dispatch he had received in Raleigh. Beads of sweat quickly formed on Johnston's brow as he read the news of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination. "Great God! Terrible!" exclaimed Johnston. He considered Lincoln's murder the greatest possible calamity to the South. The president's death would cast a dark shadow on the meetings at Bennett Place. As Sherman began to consider how to treat the defeated foe, he kept Lincoln's wishes for reunion in mind. Sherman offered Johnston terms similar to those Grant had given Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Johnston quickly pointed out that Lee had been surrounded and was forced to surrender. His own army was several days' march ahead of Sherman's force and could slip away to the lower South, or, as Sherman feared, dissolve into guerrilla bands and continue the war indefinitely. Instead, Johnston suggested an agreement where all Confederate armies in the field could surrender and the war would end. Sherman suddenly realized that here in Bennett's house he had a golden opportunity to end the war and reunite the Union with a single agreement. The two generals sought to achieve what the surrender at Appomattox had not: the end of the war and the return of the defeated Southern states to the Union. The generals decided to meet again the next day. Sherman wanted to rejoin his army in Raleigh in order to control his men. He knew they would be furious over the news of Lincoln's assassination, and he feared they would seek revenge on the citizens of Raleigh. Johnston hastened back to Hillsborough to begin drafting his own terms of a surrender agreement. On April 18th, Sherman and Johnston returned to the Bennett parlor. Johnston was accompanied by Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, who had the task of persuading President Davis to approve whatever agreement was reached. The Confederates presented a list of surrender terms they considered fair. The three men enjoyed a glass of whiskey from Sherman's saddlebags and listened to Breckinridge speak dramatically in favor of the terms. After several minutes of the oration, Sherman pushed back his chair and exclaimed, "See here, gentlemen, just who is doing the surrendering anyhow? If this thing goes on, you'll have me sending a letter of apology to Jeff Davis." From his saddlebags, Sherman removed paper and pen and began to draft his terms, bearing in mind his earlier meeting with President Lincoln in Virginia. When Sherman finished, Johnston and Breckinridge read the terms and were shocked at the close similarity to their own proposal. All Confederate armies left in the field would disband, and the men would return to their homes. Authorities in Washington would acknowledge each Southern state government. Furthermore, the President would guarantee to the Southern people their personal, political, and property rights as defined by the Constitution, and no one would be prosecuted for fighting the war. Sherman's terms fulfilled his frequent promise to aid the people of the South once they laid down their arms. Johnston and Breckinridge gladly accepted these terms and waited while 2 copies were made. Although bitter adversaries during the war, Sherman and Johnston developed a lasting friendship during their meetings at the Bennett farm. With a salute, the two parted with the confidence that they had brought an honorable end to the long and bloody war. Sherman believed he had fulfilled Lincoln's wish for peace. Instead, he found himself on the verge of destroying his career. The Bennett Place terms were received with hostility by a government mourning the loss of its leader. Sherman had authorized terms of peace that went beyond his military authority. Raleigh native Andrew Johnson was now president, and he denounced the terms as being too lenient to the South. Union Secretary of War Edwin Stanton scathingly accused Sherman of betraying his government's trust. Northern newspapers attacked Sherman for his agreement with Johnston. An editorial in the New York Herald proclaimed that, with a few strokes of the pen, Sherman has blurred all the triumphs of his sword. The terms were promptly rejected, and Sherman was ordered removed from command. General Grant personally brought this bad news to Sherman in Raleigh. Sherman sent the Confederates a dispatch announcing the rejection of the terms and the resumption of hostilities in 48 hours. General Johnston wired the fleeing President Davis in Charlotte to request new instructions. Davis desperately ordered Johnston to disband the infantry so they might be regrouped later, and he designated the cavalry as an escort for his own escape. Johnston knew that he could never regroup the remnants of his army, and that guerrilla warfare would only prolong the suffering of the Southern people. In a bold move, he disobeyed his president's order. Instead, he contacted Sherman and suggested that they meet for a third time. On April 26th, the Bennetts again opened their doors to the two generals. This time, Johnston had little choice but to accept the same terms as those agreed upon at Appomattox Courthouse. Each general affixed his signature and hoped these terms would finally end the war. In the following days, the remaining rebel troops formed in Greensboro and stacked their rifles. The men of the once Grand Army received their paroles and final pay for their service to the Confederacy, $1.17 in silver coins. Many said goodbye to friends and walked off toward their homes. The surrender at Bennett Place was the largest of the war, and with over 89,000 paroles issued for men in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. The friendship that formed between the two generals would last until Sherman's death 26 years later. The aging Johnston was an honorary pallbearer at Sherman's funeral and stood bareheaded in a cold rain as a sign of respect. A friend suggested that he should cover his head, to which Johnston replied, "If Sherman were standing here in my place, he would do the same." 1 month later, Johnston died of pneumonia. Following the surrender, the Bennetts remained on their farm. James and Nancy Bennett had lost 2 sons and a son-in-law to the war which had its greatest surrender in their parlor. The site of the Bennett farm was enshrined in 1923 with the dedication of the Unity Monument. It stands as a symbol of Sherman's and Johnston's cherished goals, so eloquently expressed in Lincoln's second inaugural address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.